And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Rosekind, who's a member of the National Transportation Safety Board. He was sworn in as the 40th member of the NTSB on June 30th, 2010, for a term that runs until 2014. And in your packet are all the speakers' bios, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading through those, but it's our honor today to have a member of the NTSB here, and I'm going to try to find his slideshow and get it going, and we'll be off to the real part of the conference.
I really want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here. One of the things I'm going to talk about is a context, an NTSB perspective on these. And one of the things that's critical is to realize while we do the investigations, issue recommendations, it's critical for us that people act on those recommendations. And so part of the reason that I'm here is so that everybody understands we don't like to just throw these things over a fence and then hope people take some action. Part of the reason I'm here is to advocate to make sure things are actually getting done. Now, my warning is I like to walk and talk. Carl put me behind this podium. I have to stand right here for the cameras. So if I pause at any moment, throw something, make sure I'm still here. I'm actually going to talk about 3 points to the second part of this, which is what's next for pipeline safety. But before they do that, I'm actually going to take almost half my time to provide that NTSB context for not just what we do, but why it's important to talk about what's next for pipeline safety. We're good. Technologically, we're good. First, let me talk about the NTSB. I have 4 slides that I hope will give you some perspective of what our work really is focused on. And it starts with this. Our mission is actually quite straightforward. We investigate accidents to determine the probable cause. And that's not just describing what happened, but why. And the why part is critical for us to meet that second mission. And that is, based on the probable cause, issue recommendations so the accidents don't happen again. And when we really think about what the NTSB does is this is the main product of what we create. And that is recommendations that basically are looking at making sure these things don't happen again. I don't mind telling you as a board member, that's my criteria. The board members are actually the ones who vote on the findings, the probable cause, and the specific safety recommendations. And my criteria for recommendation is either 1, if this was in place, this accident would not have occurred, or 2, this will prevent it from occurring in the future. So our mission is actually very straightforward, and one of the things I find interesting is explaining to people that the NTSB investigates accidents in all modes of transportation. Most people are used to seeing us in the right-hand corner there, right? Major aviation accident. Blue windbreakers, yellow, big letters on the back, NTSB. That's what people are used to, but we investigate accidents in all modes of transportation. And in fact, on this slide, Chadsworth rail accident, a distraction accident where 25 people died. We have Munford, an entire family basically wiped out in a van, a distraction. This was a duck boat in Philadelphia on the Delaware River, you might remember, and that is the San Bruno pipeline that's in the middle there. So our mission covers all modes of transportation. People like to sort of affiliate us with aviation, and we do by statute have to investigate every aviation accident, which is about 1,500, not just the big ones, but all of them. But all transportation modes fall under our umbrella. I have 2 slides now to go from the factual stuff to context. I love this slide. I hope some of you, if not all of you, are familiar with Jim Reason, who's a professor in the UK, now retired, who has this wonderful model. There are all kinds of horrible bad things that are going on, hazards out there. How come we aren't having more accidents? Or when an accident happens, why is it that that particular hazard actually ends up creating the accident? And so Jim's got this great Swiss cheese model. We have all kinds of safeguards, barriers, strategies, efforts in place to prevent those bad things, those hazards, from creating accidents. So when does the accident actually happen? Well, it's when all the holes in the Swiss cheese line up. But I use this slide because I think it's critical to understand where the NTSB fits in all this. Because what do? Well, we investigate accidents when all the holes line up. We're at the pointy end. The NTSB investigates when an actual accident has occurred. That usually means that people have lost their lives, people have been injured, significant property damage, or other kinds of environmental hazards. And so one of the things to realize is we will always be reactive because we do very thorough forensic investigations when that pointy end has occurred, when there's actually been an accident. And I bring that up because we don't work with risk models, we don't work with prevalence studies, we work when an accident has actually occurred. All right? We're at the pointy end. And I'm going to keep emphasizing that because that's part of our perspective. And since you already used the quote, that's great, because I don't mind saying I think right now the NTSB has an extremely strong board, and part of that is the vision and leadership of Debbie Hersman, who's just a terrific chairman. And she has characterized the board as the moral compass and conscience for the industry, for the transportation industry. And I think it's important to think about the board that way, because there's a lot of times we are an independent federal agency. We do not fall under the Department of Transportation, created in 1967, and I showed you what our mission is. So we get to be pure in our effort, basically, to look at what happened and make recommendations so they don't happen again. Now, we don't have regulatory or enforcement power, and that's actually probably a good thing. We get to be pure, focused on our mission. And that's why Chairman Hirschman's comment here, I think, is really critical, because a lot of times the NTSB will focus attention on issues before a company, an industry, or people are ready to actually deal with it. And I say that because we have many issues where we can see people not acting on recommendations for 5 years or 20 years before we see some kind of concrete movement in an area. Some of you may be familiar with what's called crew resource management. It's really team coordination communication in the airline industry. The NTSB was making recommendations on that 20 years before the FAA actually created regulations. In fact, I went back to look, because I will be talking about automatic and remote control shutoff valves, and I noted that the NTSB actually has some of our first recommendations in that area 40 years ago. And so this is part of what we do. And again, I think Chairman Hirschman, these are her words. The NTSB is not just the investigatory body, not just make those recommendations, but help be a moral compass for industries, trying to highlight and focus on areas people may not be ready, not just to talk about, but act on. So, what I want to do now is talk about two accidents. I'm going to stay on my NTSB context, because I'm going to actually bring you to that pointy end. We've had two accidents that have come before the board during my tenure. In December, it'll be 3 years for me. And both of these pipeline accidents came before the board while I've been there. So I'm familiar with them, and I'm not going to go through all the detail. If you haven't read these reports, I recommend you do that. But I want to just highlight a couple of aspects of the San Bruno, the PG&E San Bruno gas explosion, as well as Enbridge and Marshall, Michigan. And I'm going to highlight those again to really emphasize the NTSB's perspective, the context for my final 3 points here. One thing I'm going to just highlight, September 9th, 2010. It ends up I was sworn in, you pointed out, in June. There was a ceremonial swearing in, which is where family and friends get to come. That was actually on September 8th. And I tell you that because my mother was in town. I'm a third-generation San Francisco guy. You can touch me later, right? Everybody in California moves there. I'm third generation. But I mention that because at age 3.5, I moved to San Bruno. So I was there until I went off to college. Okay? That was a long time ago. I won't mention the number of years, but it's a lot. I've earned this. But I bring that up because this was sort of personal for me. It was not my neighborhood, but I know that city. Okay? And that's why I'm going to just start with 8 people lost their lives. Many were injured. Over 100 homes were damaged or destroyed. All right? I'm going to show you a few slides like this because this is the pointy end that we're talking about. When you think about what the NTSB is focused on, again, what's that recommendation? To prevent this from ever reoccurring again. So let me just highlight a couple things. One, I'm going to talk about the probable cause, contributing factors, and some things that contributed to the severity of the accident. In this case, I'm just going to highlight the couple of things with PG&E which had to do with inadequate quality assurance and quality control, and also the integrity management program. And one of the things is I'm actually going to try and do my best from an NTSB perspective to stay balanced, which is to say things like integrity management is a great approach, but it's been going on for a decade in pipeline, and now there have been 2 accidents that question whether it's really getting done well. Okay, and I'm going to talk, when I get to my 3 points, about why that's important. As far as contributing this is the ruptured pipe. As you know, and this is one of the issues I'm going to bring up, inaccurate records were a big issue. Seamless pipe. Well, it ends up it wasn't seamless. There were the 4 pups, and we could track actually what was going on based on the welds. And again, I'm not going to get into the specifics. It's all in the report. But that could have been found, and there were multiple opportunities to do that. The next thing for contributing factors was really looking at the regulators. And so you see at both the state and also at the federal level, we identified the grandfathering of pipelines basically as an issue. Okay, so that's what that, when we talk about pre-existing, that's our way of saying, you know, grandfathering all those pipelines to not have to be tested was an issue. And then, of course, the state levels, inadequate identification of the things that were going on at PG&E. Now, contributing to the severity. This one's interesting because I'm going to come back to it in a couple different ways. It talks about the automatic shutoff remote controls not being there, but also the delayed response. In fact, if I hit this one more time, it took 95 minutes basically to shut off the gas in San Bruno. And so at the hearing we had on the accident, the San Bruno fire chief basically said they were on defense and could only play defense for about an hour and a half because they were just waiting for the fire to go down before they could act. Okay? So this isn't just about the automatic, where you've got those control valves or not, automatic remote control, but it's also about response, which we'll talk about as well. This is the pointy end, folks. I think Carl's already started emphasizing it. In fact, I want to give all of you credit. All the safety measures, efforts, activities, good work that you do, keep it up. But this is the pointy end. If this happens, you got to figure out how do you make sure it doesn't happen again. And I'm going to come back to this, which is for all the safety work that's going on, you need to continue to push that, but also address the issues that made this happen in the first place, that protects all of you in this room from it happening again. We end up issuing 39 recommendations from this accident. 10 of those were urgent recommendations. So a lot of people don't know this, but our investigations can typically take about a year. In fact, it used to be 18 months, and since Chairman Hersman's been on board, it's about 12 months now. Why does it take so long? We're talking about meticulous, forensic, detailed, thorough investigation. It takes a long time to get there. In fact, I'm always impressed, but not in a good way, of how in the first 24, 48 hours of any accident anywhere, pretty much people have figured out what the cause was. At the NTSB, I've actually asked people, can you show me where that first 24, 48 cause actually relates to what the NTSB found at the end of our long, thorough, meticulous, and I haven't found an example yet. Okay? So that's pretty critical. What people want to jump to versus what you find over long term can be very, very different. So I bring that up because we can take a year to get that thorough investigation done, but if something is found along the way, because this is a question that's often asked, so if there's something dangerous you find, we have to wait a year for you to make a recommendation? No. If we find something, we can issue an urgent recommendation. In the PG&E San Bruno explosion, we issued 10 urgent recommendations. They were in 2 waves, and then at the board meeting issued another 29. And my colleagues and I think that 39 may be the highest number of recommendations ever made actually in a specific accident. I want to shift from San Bruno to the Enbridge release that occurred in Marshall, Michigan. And in this case, again, probable cause, contributing factors, and some of the severity. And this is the pipeline corrosion fatigue cracks, which ended up in the probable cause. And again, you can read this faster than I am, but I'm just going to point to 2 things. One is it wasn't just about the rupture and release, but it was the fact that it was 17 hours before it was identified and stopped. And you should read the specifics of that as well, because there are actually some instances where oil was pumped into the line when it was leaking because they hadn't detected that the leak was going on. And I have to highlight, Enbridge actually had a 10-minute rule. It was fascinating if you read about this accident, where they had a policy. If you couldn't figure out something was going on, in 10 minutes, shut it down. Well, in this case, that didn't happen for 17 hours. Okay, and that's why reading this report will be very interesting for you. But the other part, as you see here in the middle, is we really identified the pervasive organizational deficiencies that were going on at Enbridge, highlighting these 3 areas: the integrity management part, the training of control center, and also the insufficient public awareness and education. I'm going to hit on those a little bit as well. In this case, no deaths or injuries, but at least to my knowledge, this is the most costly cleanup. This is the most costly cleanup specifically. And it's still going on. So, we talked about the probable cause, the contributing factors. I put these up here because, again, the focus was on PHMSA. Talk about the regulation, and then also the oversight as well. And again, you can see the areas that we're listing here on the specific areas that we identified. And contributing to the severity in this, again, I think response is critical, and you see that here. It was interesting, Enbridge actually had the responders who helped deal with the leak came from another state. So the people that were available on site actually were not the effective ones to deal with what was going on. And while there were supplies, they were actually not the supplies needed for the kind of leak that occurred. Okay? So you see the focus on Enbridge and their response, but also the regulatory, basically guidance that's available for the response, and then also basically the oversight for not just being prepared, but the response as well. In this case, 19 recommendations were issued at the board meeting. And again, I think I'm not going to go through the 39 in San Bruno, the 19 here, et cetera, but I'm doing this, again, to give you context of not just the NTSB's mission, but 2 concrete accidents have been investigated, determining the probable cause, other contributing factors, and what made them worse, the severity. So let me get to my 3 points that I actually want to talk about beyond your sort of current state of safety in the pipeline industry. And I'm going to start here. I'm a recovering NASA rocket scientist in a previous life. And one of the things we talk about in complex systems is there's no magic bullet. people love to say, you don't want that to happen, find the magic bullet, and I don't care if it's a pill, whatever you want to define that as, or some specific safety thing, and whether it's integrity management or what. There's no magic bullet that's going to fix this. In any safety issue, in any mode of transportation, people look for the magic bullet. It doesn't exist. And I say that because the subtext that's not on here is that when you're trying to improve safety, it's usually complex and typically contentious. And so while people may search for the magic bullet, it's not going to exist. You're talking a long-term, hard push to continually move the safety needle forward. And that'll end up being my last slide. But let me go here. 3 points I want to make, starting with meaningful metrics. So Jeff Weiss is up after me. Due to Hurricane Sandy, he had to reschedule a meeting that he was going to focus on data. And so I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. But if you look at the San Bruno recommendations, you'll see in several of them those words, to create meaningful metrics. And that was me pushing. And so I'm going to tell you part of what my issue is with this. Starting with, I think very often we do not have clearly defined objectives and outcomes from a safety perspective of what you want to see happen. And I say that because often what we've got are keep records on this, right? Send out a survey so we know if people, right? That's what we're getting. Those are not defining the outcome. What's the safety outcome you want? And I think actually the bottom line is pretty straightforward, and Carl's already started. It'll be my last slide. You want zero, right? You want zero incidents, errors, accidents, etc. That's really what you're after. How are you going to get there? You need to define what those objectives and outcomes are in a much more clear way, I think, than exists right now. Again, just having records, now they got to be accurate, right? And they have to actually help you meet whatever your safety objective is. The next thing is, I'm a scientist. I think when you take actions, they should be data-driven. They shouldn't just be somebody saying, gut feeling here, or in my experience, this is good. There's something I've seen in scheduling very often, is there's always a horrible schedule, and you know that because whoever's screaming the loudest on a table is the one that says, oh, that's a horrible schedule. They change the schedule, and then there's the next horrible schedule, right? That's the thing about it's complex, contentious. There's not going to be a single magic bullet. So you know what? What are your issues? What actions do you take? Make those data-driven. And the next one, I really want to sort of get you thinking about this. There's a lot going on now related to risk-based kinds of strategies. And I want to encourage you to think more about performance standards instead. If you have clearly defined outcomes that you're after, then you know what? Performance is 0-1. Did you get it or not? It's not just do you have the records, are they accurate? Are they complete? That's your performance standard, not just whether or not you've got them. And the last one I just want to comment on, the board has taken a very strong stance on non-punitive reporting systems. What this means is, and I'll just start at a company level, is that all those individuals, wherever they are, I don't care if they're in an office, in the field, et cetera, that's your early warning system. And the board has emphasized the opportunity for those individuals to report errors, incidents, et cetera, in a non-punitive way, right? This is not whistleblowing. This is just, I found something, you should know about it. They're your early warning system. Some people are very concerned, I don't want to know about it. Most people are shifting in the other direction. Accidents happen here, and if you're in human factors, there's a big pyramid. Incidents are below that, errors are below that. You need to know about the errors and incidents if you want to be proactive, making sure the accidents don't happen. If you want to make sure those Swiss cheese slices don't line up, you got to have your data. So I'd actually like to suggest you think about non-punitive reporting systems at 2 levels. One is at the company level, so that basically you think about how to get the data in. And by the way, you can't just get the data and then do nothing with it, right? There has a very, very clear analytical process, so when this information comes in, you're acting on it. And again, it should serve the clear safety outcomes that you've identified. But the other thing is, I think you need to also consider how companies could have this with regulators. And you need to decide that. And in fact, let me just bring this up. In human factors, there's a classic crime and punishment approach. And I'll just use an aviation example, take it outside of pipeline. I have an aviation accident. I want to blame the pilot. Gee, if I fire that pilot, I don't have a problem anymore. That's the crime and punishment approach. That doesn't really work when it's a system problem. And if you look at the probable cause of each of those accidents, we didn't identify an individual, right? The organizational failures, et cetera. So just going in with the crime and punishment is not going to work. In fact, what you find is people that are moving away from that are getting more safety data to make changes. At the other end of the continuum, in some cases, crime and punishment is absolutely appropriate. In fact, I would say that you have to make sure that the regulators have enough teeth when they do find something to be able to make sure that their punishment is going to be appropriate enough, not just to get detention, but to get behavior change. Okay? But I do want you to think about this both at the company level, but also at the oversight level. How can you get people reporting stuff they may be uncomfortable about, but it's better to know about it than letting it go on and just fester in the system in some way? And so just a couple examples of some of these things. I put training inspection. I've already talked about the records. You know, what is the outcome that you want? We have pipeline. Yes, stuff's flowing through them. No, you need to know where the weaknesses are, right? Where's my problem going to be next? And so while I appreciate, again, the risk-based part of it, is what's my safety outcome and what performance standard or criteria is going to make sure I know before it happens next time. The next one I want to talk about, in aviation, safety is not competition. You do not compete on safety. This is a given for several decades in aviation. So I already told you I'm from California, so I'm going to start the slide with, that means you should share. And what do you share? Well, it starts with data. So what's been really interesting, in fact, I had a conversation earlier with someone who was talking about NTSB's access to certain data sets that are available in aviation. If you think about it, you make the effort to get those reporting systems and other data-driven kinds of activities going on, you want to be able to share that data. No one company is going to have the data for the whole industry. No one's going to. So when you think about what do you need to share, start with data. Next, best practices. And the third one is, you know, you got problems, people solve them, you got to share those as well. So when we have a board meeting that highlights an accident, we are often visited by everyone you could possibly imagine. When the PG&E folks came to visit about San Bruno, and there was a lot of talk about their plans and what they want to work on, I don't mind pointing out that one of the things that I sort of emphasize is it's great if you become a leader in this and do all this stuff, you better share it with the whole industry. Because it's not just about one company, it's about public safety for everybody. And every company can benefit by sharing the data, right, the best practices, and you got a problem, you figured out what to do about it, let other people know. You don't compete on safety. The last two I think are also pretty important. One is transparency. Now, media and litigation are two big reasons people like to move back from transparency. But the reality is, again, if you push it down, which is sort of a traditional way to handle data problems, et cetera, then bad things happen. And that's when the NTSB is at the pointy end, basically finding out you should have been on this beforehand. Transparency, there are ways to make sure that the data systems you create, those non-punitive reporting systems, are confidential, there are protections, et cetera. They should be shared and transparent. Again, the whole idea is to share them to enhance safety. And develop industry models. I tell you, this came up in a couple ways. In San Bruno during the hearing, I remember somebody, one of the folks in one of the panels talked about how, well, we're required to do surveys to look at public awareness. And at first I thought the chairman was brilliant. I later found out that somebody from our staff gave her the stats. But PG&E apparently sent out thousands of surveys for a public awareness campaign. And we had the data that apparently less than 100 responded. So this is one of those check the box, we did the survey, but is that going to help actually get any sense of whether the public is aware or not? The other thing that happened was the San Bruno fire chief basically was asked, tell us your knowledge about where the pipelines were, your response, et cetera. And he goes, I didn't know they were there. Now, a couple people are like, how could he not know? Well, you look at the education program and it ends up there was no solid way for him to necessarily know. Does that mean that an email wasn't sent inviting him to a briefing, or here's a link if you want to learn about XYZ, et cetera? This gets to my comment again about you need to have outcomes and performance standards, right? It's not just about did we send the surveys out, do people in the public actually know what's going on? Do your first responders have the knowledge of what's in the ground, what's being carried, and how to respond to that? And by the way, now, in these counties and cities all over the country, these people are rotating out. They're retiring, they're merging with stuff. In this county alone, actually, where this accident happened, the police chiefs and fire chiefs are changing just because of the physical nature of what's going on. Does the next person know what's happening there? So part of my bottom line, and this came up actually at the Enbridge board meeting, where I just said, is there an industry model of how the public should be educated or first responders educated? That doesn't exist. And all I would point out is there's no reason for one company to do it. But you know what? Again, best practices, you ought to develop an industry model, test it so it's data-driven, and then everybody can do it. Same thing with the response, which is why I put this up here just to sort of make a point. Again, the NTSB's been on automatic and remote control shut-off valves for a long time. And what happened in San Bruno, of course, was there was kind of an industry approach to doing this, and then there was another report that PG&E had that said, no, in high-consequence areas you can do it a little differently. If you think about it, there's got to be a standard for the industry that's data-driven for what the response should be. Okay, and again, I think this just goes to what's the safety outcome you want, fast response, what should that number be? You have a performance standard, you meet it or you don't. And one of the things that, again, was brought up at the board meeting, I thought that's really critical, is scenarios for responses. And you don't just do what's been known. In real disaster scenarios, you do what people aren't expecting. And then you see what happens. Because part of the issue, well, here's my next one. I'm already getting to the next one. This is not a typo. Theme of the conference is trust but verify. This is trust and verify. The trust but verify has to do with the finger pointing that often goes on. This is just natural. Other people are going to talk about the fractures that are going on in the nation, et cetera. But what you have to work toward, and I'll go to the bottom line here, is safety is a shared responsibility. Carl started with this one too, and I'm totally there with it. You know, it's the companies, it's the federal government, it's the state governments, it's the public. You're all in this together. We're all in this together. You work and live over these pipelines and on the highways, et cetera. These are safety issues that we all share. And that's why at some point it's got to go beyond the trust but verify, but I'm going to trust you to do it, and we're doing this collaboratively. We're sharing in the responsibility to make sure this work gets done for us all to be safe. So let me just highlight the other two things quickly. One is, I think, and the board has done this over the last 5+ years, is to really start focusing on safety culture. This starts at the leadership, but has to pervade an entire organization. And I'm not just talking about companies. I'm talking about state organizations, federal organizations. Safety culture is critical. You got to enhance and focus on that more. And I'm going to say this again because I'm going to show you the picture. I commend you for all the great safety efforts that are going on, but we're at the pointy end when bad things happen. You want to prevent that from happening again. And the other one here is oversight. And, you know, automatically people think purely of government oversight, and I think that's critical. But we just had an accident, Gulfstream, which builds corporate aircraft. They're certifying their 650, and in the certification program, they had an accident, 4 people lost their lives. Our accident, which took a little bit over a year to complete, was going on, and they basically started their own internal audit with an external review board to figure out what was going on. Now, what came out of their audit and their review lined up 100% basically with what we found. Okay, so that was good. But my message here is you don't have to wait for the accident to do your review and fix things. They did that in a reaction to a horrible tragedy where people lost their lives and an accident occurred. You can have internal independent, external independent groups that basically audit and review what's going on. And if you have clear criteria for your safety outcomes and your performance standards are 0 or 1, you know if you're doing the job. And this is just a personal bias, but if somebody comes and says you're doing a great job and they end the sentence there, bring in another group, right? Because it's complex and contentious. And I think people ought to be able to find all the good stuff you're doing and find out where you can improve. Because until you're till 0, there's stuff that you can be able to improve. And I'm going to highlight the end here again. This is a shared responsibility. You're going to know, here's your performance standard, that when you go from just pointing fingers to where, you know, better oversight, please, company take more responsibility, you know, here's what's happening to us is when it's a shared responsibility, which is why this meeting is critical, because you've got all the parties in one room, that's part of the transition that will actually get you as an industry safer. So here's a couple of bottom lines. I was thinking, what are some of the take-homes? This is it. You got a meeting. You're talking about reporting systems, responses, et cetera. These are two things I think you could use as filters for anything you want to do. Do we have a really clear, meaningful safety objective that's been defined? And what's the performance standard to meet it? And as you're trying to decide different things you want to take action on, use these two things as filters. But let me finish. What's really interesting, and again, Carl, you started raising this as well. This goes beyond San Bruno and Marshall. Over 2 million miles of pipeline. You know what's interesting, though, is these accidents have raised huge questions in our country about the integrity of the U.S. transportation infrastructure. And now this is beyond pipeline. So you're bringing up some other issues as well. But now, frankly, the pipeline accidents that have occurred in particular have really raised the visibility for the entire U.S. infrastructure. And it's not just maintained now. As you know, with certain kinds of destructions that happened, like in Sandy, there's an issue. Do you rebuild? So we're talking about design, build, as well as maintain. And I don't have to tell you that part of the issue with the infrastructure is just how old it is. Hence, the testing and maintenance of those systems in every mode of transportation has really become critical. So, last 2 slides. For this one, I'm going to bring it back to the pointy end. I'm going to do this one more time. all the safety efforts, integrity management, the activities you've got, these are critical. You must continue to pursue all of them. But you also need to ask yourself what else needs to get done. So this is the pointy end. This is what you're trying to prevent. And one of the things I want to highlight, if you want to change the safety culture, the NTSB, to some extent, will always be reactive. We're on site at the pointy end when an accident has already occurred. What you want to do is make this transition from reactive to proactive. You need data to do it. You need clear objectives. You need performance standards. You need to be able to figure out how you're going to get there very clearly. And that's why, before I came to the board, I always thought, oh, this is a media thing, it's fantasy. But I realized, you know what your safety goal really needs to be? It's got to be zero. Anything less than zero, well, zero what? Incidents, errors, accidents, deaths, injuries, missed data, it's got to be zero. Now, whether you can ever get there, I don't know. But anything less than that as your ultimate goal is really unacceptable. And what I would say that as an industry, every effort you put into getting closer and closer to that, and this is another one of Chairman Hirschman's things, raises the bar on safety for your entire industry, which basically benefits all of us who work and live over pipelines. So whether you ever reach zero or not, that's a clear performance standard, but your efforts to get there, constantly improving, so those lines go up, right? Down. Those would be zero to down. Basically, you want to hit zero. Every effort that goes to that will improve the safety for your industry and the public, which really has to be that ultimate zero outcome that you're all after. Thanks very much.